In the summer of 1787, in a locked room in Philadelphia, 55 men sat in stifling heat with the windows sealed shut, not for comfort, but for secrecy. Outside, a nation held its breath. Inside, they were doing something almost no one in human history had attempted before, designing a government from scratch, on paper, by argument alone. No king, no conquest, no divine right. Just a group of deeply flawed, deeply human men, betting that reason could hold together what force usually did. They almost failed. More than once, delegates walked out. More than once, the entire convention nearly collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Chief among them, a nation founded on liberty that was, at the very same table, negotiating the future of slavery. This is the story of how 13 fractured colonies, distrustful of each other and terrified of tyranny, became something new. Not because it was inevitable, because it was, against every reasonable expectation, made to work.
To understand the Constitution, you have to understand what came before it and why it nearly doomed the American experiment before it began. The 13 colonies that declared independence in 1776 were never one people. Massachusetts Puritans and Virginia planters had almost nothing in common. Different economies, different religions, different visions of what a good society even looked like. What united them wasn't shared identity, it was a shared enemy, the British Crown, and its habit of taxing colonies that had no voice in Parliament. No taxation without representation wasn't just a slogan. It was a genuine constitutional grievance, rooted in centuries of English legal tradition about consent and government. When Parliament passed the Stamp Act, then the Townshend Acts, then closed the port of Boston in retaliation for the Tea Party, the colonies didn't unite out of ideology. They united out of necessity. The Revolutionary War that followed was long, brutal, and
During the war, the Continental Congress had drafted a framework to bind the states together, the Articles of Confederation. It was ratified in 1781, and it reflected the founders' deepest fear at the time. Not disorder, but tyranny. They had just fought a war against a powerful central government. Naturally, they built a new government designed to be weak. Under the Articles, there was no president, no national court system, no power to tax. Congress could ask states for money, but couldn't compel them to pay. It could pass laws, but had no way to enforce them. Each state, regardless of size, had one vote, and most major decisions required unanimous consent from all 13. For a brief period, this seemed tolerable, but cracks appeared almost immediately. States printed their own currencies, which fluctuated wildly in value. They taxed each other's goods as if they were foreign nations. The national government, unable to raise revenue, couldn't pay its war debts or fund an army. Then, in the winter of 1786, the fragility became a crisis. In western Massachusetts, a former Continental Army captain named Daniel Shays led an armed uprising of farmers, men who had fought for independence and returned home to find themselves crushed by debt, facing farm foreclosures and even imprisonment for unpaid taxes. Shays and his followers shut down courts by force to stop the foreclosures, and eventually marched on a federal armory in Springfield. The rebellion
55 delegates arrived in Philadelphia that summer, representing 12 of the 13 states. Rhode Island, distrustful of centralized authority, refused to send anyone at all. The men in that room were not saints. They were lawyers, planters, merchants, and statesmen, and they carried the assumptions and blind spots of their era. But many of them were also extraordinarily capable political thinkers. James Madison arrived having spent months studying the history of failed confederacies, stretching back to ancient Greece, determined not to repeat their mistakes. He would later be remembered as the father of the Constitution.
But there was a second question tangled inside the first one, and it exposed the deepest fracture in the American founding. If representation was based on population, would enslaved people count? Southern states, where enslaved people made up a huge portion of the population but held no rights or freedom, wanted them counted fully to boost Southern political power in Congress. Northern states argued that if enslaved people were property, not citizens, they shouldn't count at all. The result was the 3/5 compromise. Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. It was not a moral middle ground. It was a political calculation that increased Southern power in Congress while formally treating millions of human beings as fractional persons under the law. The Constitution also included a clause protecting the international slave trade from federal interference for at least 20 years, and a fugitive slave clause requiring states to return people who had escaped bondage. None of this was an accident or an oversight. It was a foundational compromise, one that allowed the Union to form, and one that planted a contradiction so severe it would ultimately require a civil war 74 years later to resolve. The founders who spoke most eloquently about liberty were in the same breath writing protections for slavery into the nation's founding document. That tension didn't weaken the Constitution's importance, but it defines how we have to understand it. By September of 1787, the convention had produced a document, the Constitution of the United States. It created a federal government with 3 separate branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, each designed to check and balance the others so that power could never concentrate in one place the way it had under the British Crown. But writing the Constitution was only half the battle. It now needed to be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states, and that was far from guaranteed. Opposition was fierce. Critics, known as anti-federalists, warned that the new federal government was simply a monarchy in disguise, that a strong central authority, once established, would inevitably swallow the liberties the Revolution had just won. Patrick Henry, the fiery orator who had once declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," became one of the Constitution's loudest opponents, warning it endangered the very freedoms it claimed to protect. Step back, and the scale of what happened in Philadelphia becomes clearer. This wasn't a document handed down from a monarch or imposed by conquest. It was negotiated, argued over, revised, and ultimately ratified through public debate. An extraordinary bet that a large, diverse republic could govern its. In that sealed room in Philadelphia, 55 men built something fragile, contradictory, and unfinished. And somehow, it held. Not because they were wiser than the men who came before them, but because they built room for the argument to continue. The Constitution they wrote in 1787 is still the framework the United States operates under today, the oldest continuously functioning written national constitution in the world. Every amendment since has been part of the same unfinished conversation those delegates started in that sweltering room. What does it actually mean for a government to be of, by, and for the people? That conversation isn't over. It never really was. If you want to understand where a nation is going, you have to understand the compromises and the contradictions it was built on. That's what this channel is here to do. Not to simplify history, but to sit with its complexity.